Hello, everybody. My name is Ramona Gönzel, and I'm an associate professor in Romanian language at UCL CES. I'm also the academic coordinator for CES's online language evening class program, the convener and co-director of the ProLang research group. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you, Professor Kulik, for honoring us with your presence from Kyiv under the current circumstances. Thank you, Ukrainian Institute, for the wonderful co-organization of this event. And special thanks go to Sasha Dovzhik, Rachel Morley, Olesya Kromeychuk, and Patricia Gabalova. We'll start with a couple of housekeeping rules. So as you've probably noticed, we are recording the event. And the other thing we'd like to mention is if you have questions and answers, could you please post them on the question and answer function, not in the chat, if possible. We have people who are gonna select and try to answer as many questions as possible. I just want to say a few words about ProLang, which is a new interdisciplinary initiative set up at CES UCL by myself, together with a few more colleagues, many present here tonight. ProLang stands for Policy, Research and Outreach in the field of language-based area studies, with particular focus on languages of the Central, Eastern, Southeastern Europe and the Baltic region that we cover through our degree and evening classes. We offer a total of 18 languages from the region. ProLang aims are to provide a forum for colleagues from the UK and partner universities and beyond to collaborate on interdisciplinary research topics with languages at the core, to interact with policymakers, practitioners, and the public in order to aid and inform wider debates in language-based area studies and cultural, economic, political, and sociological research, to ensure that languages remain in focus in the post-Brexit landscape, to inform and support research and to drive forward new research drawing on the wide linguistic expertise of our academic staff, to increase the esteem of CES as a global leader in the language-based area studies. I will also post a link to our online evening class program in the chat. Beginner classes start in October. Other levels can join at the start of term 2 and term 3 as well. This is a crucial time for the whole world to reconnect and collaborate long-term through educational endeavors that impact our world. And this is what we're doing here tonight. I will now give the microphone to Associate Professor William Blecker, who is an Associate Professor in Ukrainian and East European culture, and who will chair this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramona, and thank you so much to the ProLang group and also to the Ukrainian Institute London for organising this event with such a distinguished speaker on such an important topic. It's a real pleasure and an honour for me to introduce our speaker this evening. He has, in all my years of studying Ukraine, he's always been one of the kind of leading lights and the leading figures in the field, and the person who you really, when you want to think about language in Ukraine, his name comes to your mind immediately. So it's a real honor to have him, to host him virtually at UCL at CES and in collaboration with the Ukrainian Institute London. So our speaker this evening is Professor Volodymyr Kulik. He is the head research fellow at the Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. His research fields include politics of language, memory and identity, contemporary Ukraine, media and discourse studies, and he has published widely in Ukrainian and Western journals and a number of collected volumes. His latest book, he's the author of 3 books, his latest being Дискурс українських медій, ідентичності, ідеології, владні стосунки, Ukrainian Media Discourse, Identities, Ideologies, Power Relations, published by Critica in 2010. And he's also edited 2 collected volumes published in Ukraine, and also 2 special issues of Western academic journals. And I think the latest monograph is, in fact, Language Politics in Multicultural Countries, Foreign Experience and its Application in Ukraine, which is published in 2021. So that's the most recent. Yeah, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, Voldemar.
Thank you, William. It's been great pleasure to be able to talk in such a distinguished series under the kind of roof of the Ukrainian Institute, which is doing fantastic work in promoting Ukrainian culture and all things Ukrainian in the world. And I'm glad to hear that many people have signed up for this event. So the interest in this topic is unabated. I've been studying these issues for kind of 20 years now, and language is always something people want to know about Ukraine, which is on the one hand good because I'm in demand. On the other hand, sometimes it becomes a bit depressing that people are still asking the same questions. I thought I already answered, yeah, but then times changes, situation changes, data change, yeah. So I get new data to check whether what I said some 5 or 10 or even 2 years ago is still valid. And so I'm happy that I will be able to talk about established beliefs, problematic beliefs, also false beliefs about Ukraine and Ukrainian language situation and use of languages and language identities. But also I will be able to present very new data coming from a representative survey of Ukrainian population conducted in December 22, so very, very fresh. I just got the data a couple of hours before New Year's Eve, kind on, I don't know, 7 p.m. or something on December 31st. So I talked a bit about this data in my Facebook feed, but this is actually the first time I presented in a public lecture. So let me share my screen and okay. Okay, so let me check how it works. Language situation is changing, but this is not necessarily taken into account in media reports or social media talk about language situation. So people have some established preconceptions, I would say misconceptions, yeah, and it is tempting to call some of them myths, so old and deeply rooted they are. But situation is changing both due to the inertia of independence. So the longer Ukrainian state exists, the more the situation is similar to that of nation state and less similar of post-colonial states, yeah, and especially Russian invasion of 2014 and 2022 contributed to change, accelerated change. So change can be gradual or change can be rapid. So in these two cases, especially 2022, the scale of invasion, the brutality of invasion kind of shattered many people's assumptions and practice. So the change became more rapid. So, but we are in the process of that. So data cannot fully reflect that. So the change is ongoing. So more will follow. So I will need more surveys or more focus groups on more analysis of media discourse and so on. So I will organize my talk by several established misconceptions about Ukrainian language situation. I will involve a number of arguments to counter these misconceptions. And of course, if you have some other ideas, some other questions, then we'll kind of extend the list of these conceptions or misconceptions if you want to ask a question and I would believe that presents misconceptions, then I will counter it. If you want to counter yourself and ask me for data to help you counter that, then I will be happy to oblige. So let me start with maybe most best known, most widespread belief about Ukrainian language situation. So Ukraine is supposedly linguistically divided. So it is kind of torn between predominantly Ukrainian-speaking West and Russian-speaking East. I say predominantly is a bit is a step in the direction of kind of disproving the stereotype, because stereotype doesn't work with shades. It is Ukrainian language dominates in the West and Russian language dominates in the East, and there is truth to that in terms of big differences between regions. So regions are indeed greatly dissimilar in their linguistic profiles. And the main division is indeed between West and East, or more accurately, between West and Center on the one hand, and East and South on the other hand. I will show you shortly the charts where this difference will be clearly demonstrated. But also I will demonstrate that language landscape changes gradually as you go from West to Southeast. It's not like Belgium. It's not like Switzerland, when you cross the boundary between cantons or provinces and you find yourself in a very different linguistic reality. There is no place in Ukraine where you would, when you travel, encounter such an abrupt change. So change is always gradual. In addition to regional differences, which are indeed very big, but which are gradual, you see differences between cities and villages within region. So it is only the normal practice is that cities are much more Russian-speaking than villages. For historical reasons, for migration reasons. So Russians were moving primarily to cities, and then because of the nature of industries and high culture and all that under the imperial regimes, the cities were much more Russian-speaking, much more Russified, and Russian-speaking in terms of the practices of the migrant population. So villages were left more Ukrainian as they were. Only in the Western provinces, Galicia and to an extent Volhynia, during the late Soviet times and early independence time, Ukrainian dominated in both cities and villages. And only in Crimea, Russian and parts of the Donbass, maybe Russian was dominant in both cities and villages. So in most other regions, especially in the center, there is a lot, or at least there was a lot of Russian. In the cities, for example, in the capital, in Kyiv, Kyiv was predominantly Russian-speaking in the Soviet times. But villages around that, you move 20 kilometers from Kyiv and you encounter a lot of Ukrainian. So Kyiv Oblast is predominant, and even was at the Soviet time predominantly Ukrainian speaking. So in addition to these differences, there is one similar tendency: gradual change from Russian to Ukrainian. So all regions become more Ukrainian speaking with time. On top of that, East and South have been changing more rapidly than the West, because the West was Ukrainian speaking all along. So there was almost close to the ceiling. There is no more much room to change in favor of Ukrainian. But East and South gradually became more Ukrainian speaking and thus less dissimilar at least from the center. So let me show these arguments in charts. What's happening? This is the, so I will start with a bit older data before Euromaidan and, of 2000 and the Russian invasion of 2014. I would like to show that some of these conceptions, for example, that Ukraine is linguistically divided, were not quite accurate, or rather false already 10 years ago. It's not that Russian invasion of 2022 made them false, changed the situation so rapidly. They didn't correspond to linguistic reality even then. But then I will proceed to more recent data, show how it is changing. So this is 2012. All charts I will be showing come from surveys conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, one of the most reputable Ukrainian sociological institutions. I have commissioned from them 5 surveys in different years. So in most of them, there was the same core of questions about language and identity. So I will be talking about language today. I can compare our data from different years and see how the situation will change in terms of practices, what people do, or rather what people say they do linguistically, what languages they speak in what situations, and what people believe and what the people want. So what's their attitude to language processes in society, language policies and the states, and preferences, what people want society to be and what people want the state to do. Let's start with this chart. It is about so-called language of convenience. So it is not reported language. It is the language elicited by an interviewer in interaction with the respondent. So interviewer enters, originally it was face-to-face interview, so interviewer enters the respondent's home and starts talking, switching back and forth between the 2 main languages of Ukraine, Ukrainian and Russian. So trying to elicit what language is indeed preferable for the respondent. Yeah, so either by their responding in that language, or if they also switch back and forth, then asking them whether they are convenient, asking them if they are sure, asking them what language they speak more often, and so on. So there is this technique which arguably not ideal, but going a long way toward establishing what language is indeed preferred to respondents. It is not respondent as existing in isolation. It is preferred to respondent as existing in society, as existing in certain city or village, in certain region where there is a tradition of talking to strangers in a certain language. If you don't know a person, if a person says that he or she represents a certain institution, what language is used to that? So in a way, it's a mixture of language best known to the respondents, a language that he or she considers most appropriate for talking to strangers. So that's what we have. And we see a striking difference between 2 left columns and 2 right columns. Yeah, so we see that in the West and the center, blue columns are much taller than red columns. So Ukrainian is the language of convenience for most people. In the West, it's almost 100%. In the center, I say is, but it was, yeah, in 2012, 10 years ago, and 11 years ago already. In the center, a bit less so, but still a great majority prefers Ukrainian. And in South and East, a great majority preferred Russian. And in Donbass and Crimea, here I divide the southern and western regions in 2 parts. The most Russian-speaking, Donbass and Crimea, which at that time fully belonged to Ukraine, were fully controlled by Ukrainian authorities, and the rest from Kharkiv in the east to Odessa in the south, which I call south/east here. Yeah, so we can see kind of 2 poles, West and Donbass and Crimea, almost fully unilingual, and 2 predominantly unilingual, but with a big chunk of the other language. Yeah, so predominantly Ukrainian speaking center, predominantly Russian speaking southeast. But keep in mind that within each region there is this other parts in the center. It's Russian-speaking cities or partly Russian-speaking cities. Yeah, in the south and east, it's partly Ukrainian-speaking or largely Ukrainian-speaking villages. Yeah. So that was language of convenience as elicited by interviewers 11 years ago. So let's move on to demonstrate the difference between cities and villages by region in 2012. In 2012, it is a reported language. It is what language reporters say they primarily use in everyday life. And it was a five-digit, 5-point scale from only Ukrainians through mostly Ukrainians through equally Ukrainian and Russians through mostly Russian to only Russian. Yeah, and a couple of percent says other languages. Yeah, so I will exclude this data on other languages. So my talk will be about bilingual Ukrainian, about Ukraine where most people speak either Ukrainian or Russian or both. Yeah, so here what we see that in all regions, cities are less Ukrainian speaking than villages. The difference is very big in Ukraine as a whole. The right column, so it's something like 2/3 of all people speaking Ukrainian, primarily Ukrainian in villages, and less than 1/3 speaking Ukrainian in the cities. And we see that the difference is not so big in the West, where the majority speaks Ukrainian in both cities and villages, as I said. And in Southeast, the majority speaks Russian. So the small minority speaking Ukrainian, even in the villages, yeah. But in the cities, it's almost non-existent. 11 years ago, again, the difference was the largest, the biggest in the center. Yeah, so you know, almost 80% speaking Ukrainian in villages, and something like 50%, 50 plus in the cities. Yeah, at least that's what the respondents said themselves. So this is about internal differences in the regions between cities and villages. Let's move on. We are now demonstrating the difference. I employ 3 surveys, 2012, 2017, and very recent 2022. So 5-year interval between each. So we see the situation before Euromaidan and the first Russian invasion. We see situation in between, so post-Euromaidan government, pro-Ukrainian language politics, and impact of this alienation from Russia and partly from Russian language, but not so much as we will see in a moment. In 2017 and finally 2022, large-scale Russian invasion and very big, very drastic alienation from Russia and all things Russian, including for many Russian language. So we see that in the West, as I say, the situation didn't change much because it was predominantly Ukrainian, overwhelmingly Ukrainian speaking all along. So there was simply not much space to change. The situation was changing in the center. In the last survey, before that, not much. When you see very small differences, keep in mind that these differences are likely within the margin of error. For example, the difference between 2 first columns for the center, it seems like in 2017, the center was less Ukrainian speaking than in 2012. Definitely, it's a statistical error. So there is no real social substance to that. So this is just imperfections of sampling. Sample reflects the whole population, but not ideal. So there is an error, some 3%, and actually in the latest surveys, due to the occupation of large part of the Ukrainian territory and the closing of Ukrainian, shutting down Ukrainian mobile phones in those territories, which made respondents from those territories unavailable to sociologists. massive dislocation of the population, migration both internally and externally. So those internally displaced could be reached by cell phones, externally displaced couldn't. So I'm saying that in 2022 there was a larger, cannot be fully calculated, but definitely a larger error, maybe 5 or maybe even 7%. So we should keep in mind that if we see a difference, it's not necessarily a statistically significant difference. But as a rule of thumb, at least anything larger than 10% is surely statistically significant. Probably anything larger than 5 or 6% is also significant. Yeah, especially between the first two surveys. So we see that in the center, the share of Ukrainian somewhat increased in 2022. But the largest, the biggest difference is definitely the largest growth of the column is in the East and South. So that's where the difference is. So the share of Ukrainian grows steadily, but between 2012 and 2017, it was much smaller than between 2017 and 2022. So Ukraine becomes more Ukrainian speaking, first and foremost, because the East and South, those regions which used to be predominantly Russian speaking, are becoming more Ukrainian speaking. It is still not a majority of Ukrainian, but let's keep in mind that this does not mean, if we see that in the East and South, in the last survey, we see something like 30%, maybe 29, say they speak primarily Ukrainian. Yeah, so that doesn't mean that 70% speak primarily Russian, because a large part says they speak both languages equally. So as I will show, in fact, the share of Russian is smaller than the share of Ukrainian, because the rest says they speak both languages equally. Whether or not these shares are equal, whether or not the presence of both languages is equal and in their lives, surveys cannot establish. So observations are needed for that, interviews are needed for that. So that's a different story. In this lecture, I will be talking only about what people say in surveys themselves, so and compare from one year to another, from one practice to another. Okay, so let's look at the change of languages of convenience. So if we believe that the drastic change from 2017 to 2022 might be because the respondents are so angry with Russia that they exaggerate their abandoning of Russian and their switch to Ukrainian. So let's look at the actual situation in interaction between interviewers and responders. Yeah, so this language of convenience, where the respondent doesn't simply ask, the interviewer doesn't simply ask the respondent, but tries to establish what language the respondent actually prefers. Yeah, so we see an increase in this language of convenience in all regions, but again, the most drastic and a really drastic increase in the South and East. And what that means? It's not that all people in the East and South overnight became Ukrainian speakers. That they became more comfortable speaking Ukrainian. This means first and foremost that they wanted to be seen as Ukrainian speakers, that they said to the interviewers that they wanted to be interviewed in Ukrainian, that their act of choosing the language is sociolinguistically significant, but also politically significant. So that's the idea of what is the right thing to do in this interaction. So they don't want to be seen as Russian speakers. Yeah, so only a small minority now wants to be seen as Russian speakers. So 2/3 of all respondents, 2/3 of all respondents in the South and East now prefer to be interviewed in Ukrainian. That gives the right to assume, the reason to assume that they would also be willing to use Ukrainian in other public practices, talking to the authorities, talking to salespeople at supermarket, talking to tellers at a bank, and so on. So again, there can be significant differences between different practices, but there is definitely a huge change. So before 2022, before this large-scale invasion, most people in the East and South preferred Russian and saw no problems being seen as people preferring Russian. Now they understand that's the wrong thing to do. They don't want to be speaking Russian to a stranger. They want to be registered as Russian speakers. So they switch, at least in this practice, to Ukrainian. So we need to establish what they do in other practices. But here the picture is clear. So let's move now to the second misconception. So, Russian speakers are a distinct group, definitely separate from Ukrainian speakers, having a clear identity and particular policy preferences. So simply speaking, Russian speakers want Ukraine to remain bilingual and themselves to remain Russian speakers, and the state to cater to their linguistic needs, so to allow as much of as possible of Russian in all social domains. Yeah, so that's the story. Yeah, that's the misconception. So now let's see how we can counter that. I would argue that first, Russian speakers cannot be clearly defined as a group because they are not. There is no one criterion by which Russian speakerness can be established. So there is a big discrepancy between language practice, what language people speak in everyday life, and language identity, what language people believe is their native language. And my research established long ago already that language people call native cannot be no less consequential for their policy choices than language people speak. So many Russian speakers actually want the state to promote their native language rather than their spoken language. Second point, Russian speakers are more likely to identify in civic rather than linguistic or ethnic terms. So in civic terms as Ukrainians, then in linguistic terms as Russian speaker, or in ethnic terms as Russian. So some of them are Russian or used to be Russian now. Now I will show that most of them no longer identify as Russian. Yeah. Third point, many Russian speakers support the use of Ukrainian in society and promotion by the state, either because they believe that Ukrainian is their native language, or even if they call Russian their native language, they believe that Ukrainian is the national language and as such should be promoted first and foremost. Or they believe that Ukrainian was unfairly discriminated against during the Soviet times, and now justice needs to be done to restore its prevalence. Yeah, and so finally, this support for the use and promotion of Ukrainian is increasing again steadily, but particularly in the wake of Russian aggression of 2022. So let's again demonstrate these points on the charts. So Russian as everyday language and as native language. So yes, we see that in all surveys, there was a difference between these columns. Yeah, so the blue column is Russian as every percentage of people calling Russian their main language of everyday life. So those who say they speak primarily, exclusively Russian or primarily Russian in their everyday life. Yeah, and so these blue columns and red columns are those who call Russian their native language. Again, the option was either Ukrainian native language or Russian native language or both. So it's not Ukrainian plus Russian equals 100%. Yeah. So we see that both blue and red columns become shorter with time. So the share of Russian either as everyday language or as native language is decreasing steadily. But the difference between the columns persists or even increases. Yeah, and definitely in 2017, the difference increased because the share of Russian as native language decreased faster than the share of Russian as everyday language. So simply speaking, many Russian speakers first change their language identity and only then change language practice. After 2014, Euromaidan and the Russian invasion in Crimea in the Donbass, many people decided they do not want to be ethnic Russians, and even more people decided they do not want to be Russian speakers. Yeah, so they declared that their native language is Ukrainian. First, maybe said the native language are both Ukrainian and Russian, and then Ukrainian only. But they retained Russian as in language practice. So they still didn't have problems declaring to the interviewers that their primary language of everyday use is Russian. Now that changed too. So even Russian as everyday language is decreasing. Actually, we saw that in the previous chart. But the point here is that at each point in time, there is a big difference between the amount of Russian speakers as defined by everyday language and the amount of Russian speakers as defined by native language. So you cannot define this group in clear terms. So the boundaries of the group are blurred, especially if you take into account that many people speak both Ukrainian and Russian on occasion, and many people declare both Ukrainian and Russian their native language. So the group is not clear-cut. The boundaries are not sharp. It's the first point. Let's now look at these identifications. Do Russian speakers believe that they are primarily Russian speakers? So let's look at, so here what I say Russian speakers in the title of the chart is those people who say that they primarily speak Russian in everyday life. Yeah. So now we look at their salient identification. So the question was, there is a list of 20 characteristics. Please tell which no more than 3 characteristics are best describe you. Yeah. So we see. And then I cut this Russian-speaking parts. Yeah. So this is not for all respondents, but for those who say that they speak primarily Russian. So we see that the most salient identity, the identity people mention most often, are not Russian speakers, but Ukrainian. Ukrainian can be ethnic Ukrainian or civic Ukrainian. We assume that most of them call themselves Ukrainian in civic terms, but here it is not clear, so it is both. Yeah, but definitely whatever people mean by Ukrainian, this identity as a Ukrainian is more salient to them than their identity as Russian speakers. And we see that identity as Russians didn't even make it to this chart because it is less than 10% here. I only provide, to make it legible, I only provide the most salient identities. So, but we see that Russian speaker is definitely less salient than Ukrainian speaker. So the fact that people speak primarily Russian is not most consequential to their identification and their policy choices. So does not necessarily defines what they are and what they want. So this is a very important point, which is often overlooked. Many people assume just because they are Russian speakers, these people definitely want to be Russian speakers, want the Ukrainian state to be bilingual, want the state to promote Russian equally as a Ukrainian. So this is wrong. This is not the case. Now let's compare the civic identification, Ukrainian, and ethno-linguistic identification as Russian speakers or Russian by region. We see that Ukrainian identity is the most salient both in the Western Center and Eastern South. Russian-speaking identity is actually, in a Russian identity, are more salient in Eastern South. So when you have environment, around you, most people speak Russian. Around you, many people believe they are Russians. So your identity has this kind of fertile ground to be sustained. be perpetuated. So hence the difference, especially we see it for Russian-speaking identity. Yeah, so many more people believed that they were Russian speakers primarily in East and South than in the West and Center. But even in the East and South, Ukrainian identity was more salient than Russian-speaking identity. So this is an additional proof that the fact that people speak Russian doesn't necessarily mean that they want to be part of this group of Russian speakers and want the policy aimed at preservation of this group. Now let's ask, I referred several times to policy preferences. Now let's look at this policy preference. So I will provide two charts responses to two questions. One is about preferences regarding language situation in the future. The question was like that. What would you like Ukrainian language situation to be in the future? In Ukrainian perspective. It was not specified whether near future or distant future, but in the future, we see the difference. So the choice was, there was three alternatives. Ukrainian would be the main language of all domains. Ukraine would be bilingual country, and Russian would be main language of all domains. So the share of Russian as main language was always minuscule, some 3% or 2%. In the last survey is less than 1%. So I add this preference to bilingualism. So red columns are bilingual and Russian dominant together, and blue columns are Ukrainian dominant. So again, these are preferences of Russian speakers, so people who say they speak primarily Russian in everyday life. 2012 demonstrates kind of normal preferences, what could be expected. Yeah, the large majority of Russian speakers wanted Ukraine to be a bilingual country, meaning Russian language would be equal to Ukrainian. They will have all the possibilities of using it and have no problems in any domain. Yeah. So, but this preference becomes less overwhelming by 2017, and it completely disappeared. Went under in 2022. So by 2022, the majority, more than 50% of Russian speakers actually want Ukraine to become the main language in the future. So at least in the future, that means maybe not now, maybe we will personally not be affected. We will continue speaking Russian as long as we live. But for our children, for our grandchildren, for the future of our country, we want Ukrainian to be main language of all social domains. So, meaning Russian speakers do not necessarily want Russian to be perpetuated as such a prevalent language as it was inherited from the Soviet times. Again, this is the refutation of a widespread misconception. So another question, state policy in the language sphere. Again, the question was, how do we think what the state policy in the language sphere should primarily do? And there were three options. Promote Ukrainian in all domains, solve the issue of the status of Russian, and then protect the rights of national minorities in linguistic sphere. So I present the two first options. The share of those who want the rights of national minority to be promoted is rather stable, something like 12 to 15% in all surveys. But the most interesting story is the two first questions. So for Russian speakers, we see that in 2012, a majority, not so large as in previous survey, in the previous question, but a large majority, 60%, wanted the state to solve the problem of the status of Russian. Actually, to grant Russian some kind of official status, either the second state language or regional language. Mind you, this is the year when the so-called Kivalo-Kolesnichenko law was adopted. Yeah, so Russian was made elevated to the status of regional language. Regional meaning local official, regional official language. In cities and in certain oblasts of East and South, it became official. Supposedly, formally lower in status than Ukrainian, but for all practical purposes equal to Ukrainian. Yeah. So, and in 2012, a majority of Russian speakers wanted promotion of Russian. So the survey was conducted in February, and the law was adopted in July. So they wanted Yanukovych, then president, to implement his electoral promise to elevate the status of Russian. So kind of what could be expected. Russian speakers wanted the promotion, the elevation of Russian. By 2017, the preference becomes a bit less strong, and an increased share of Russian speakers actually want the promotion of Ukrainian as the main task of the state language policy. But still the situation did not drastically change. In 2022, this is absolutely overhaul. Yeah, so half of all Russian speakers believes that the main task of the state language policy is promotion of Ukrainian in all spheres of social life. Yeah. So, and only 10%, a very small minority, only 10% want, still want the elevation of the status of Russian. So this demonstrates that Russian speakers have radically changed their attitudes, radically changed their policy expectations, that now they are similar to Ukrainian speakers in their preference for policy at aiming at the strengthening of Ukrainian, promotion of Ukrainian, making Ukrainian the main language of all social domains. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would stop speaking Russian. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would not want any Russian around them in any supermarket or in any bank, in any doctor's office. But that means that the priorities of the state policies and priorities of language situation in society are now definitely in favor of Ukraine. And finally, the third misconceptions, which might be even number one, judging by how often I hear the journalists request to comment on that. Russian speakers are discriminated against, especially in the wake of the Euromaidan and the changes in language policy by the Poroshenko government. Yeah. So how can we refute that? It's not as easy, but we can first look at what people say themselves. So in a key survey, not my survey, it's a different survey by the same institution in May 2022, fully 90% of Russian speakers said that they were not discriminated against. So they refuted this allegations themselves. In a different survey in March by rating group, 74% of Russian speakers said that there were no problems between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers. And further, some 10% said that there is a problem, but it is minor, something, I don't remember exactly, but something like 10% said that there is a major problem. And remarkably, in this survey, more Ukrainian speakers believed that there was a problem, meaning for them, it was a problem of Russification, of lingering prevalence of Russian in many domains where they believe there should be Ukrainian. So for Russian speakers, there was not much of a problem. And now let's look at a different kind of proof. That if Russian speakers were to be discriminated against, that would be demonstrated, for example, in public communication, in the workplace. So assuming Russian speakers want to speak Russian, they speak Russian at home, but when they leave the home and go to the bigger world, so they need a job, they cannot find a job where they can freely speak Russian, so they are forced to speak Ukrainian. So if that were the case, we would see that there would be much more Ukrainian in the workplace than at home, so much less Russian. But in fact, this is the opposite picture. Russian has been traditionally more widespread in workplace than at home. So in fact, many Ukrainian speakers, when they went out and started working, had to switch to Russian because of preferences of bosses or maybe customers or maybe some inertia, different factors, but definitely that was the case. In 2022, the first time, it is no longer the case. So Russian became less prevalent in the workplace than at home. I will show you a chart in a minute. And second argument that can be made against that argument about discrimination is that Russian speakers are actually supportive of the use of Ukrainian in public administration and service industry. They do not consider that discrimination. That considers that the proper linguistic behavior to meet linguistic demands of their customers. So they understand that they need to be able and willing to speak Ukrainian, at least if addressed in Ukrainian, because otherwise their customers could not exercise their right to use Ukrainian. So let's look at these two arguments in charts. Ukrainian as the main language of home and work or study in three surveys, 2012, 2017, 2022. We see that in the first two surveys, blue columns are taller than red columns, so meaning at home, the share of Ukrainian was higher, so than at work, meaning part of Ukrainian speakers had to switch to Russian in their workplace. In 2022, it's the other way around. So the difference is not big yet, but it is significant already. So something like two-thirds of all people now say they use primarily Ukrainian in workplace. This is partly it may be as a result of the war, how willingness of people to declare that, but actually it is also, in my view, a reflection of the linguistic situation, namely the language law of 2019, which made Ukrainian mandatory and in many social practices, including service industries, not just in public services, in public administration for public servants, but also in private sphere, in service industries. There is now the requirement that Ukrainian be the default language. So salespeople and bank tellers must address you first in Ukrainian, then if you prefer Russian and they are fine with speaking Russian, the service could be in Russian or any other language. But first it starts with Ukrainian. So it's not fully observed in all parts of Ukraine. It's definitely different in Odessa than in Kyiv and in Kharkiv than in Vinnytsia. But at least in Kyiv, I fully see the difference. So this is reflected here. So we see that Ukrainian is increasingly used in workplace. And so now for the first time, Ukrainian speakers are no longer discriminated against. So how much Russian speakers are discriminated against, we'll see in the next chart. In the next chart. So here, preferences of Russian speakers for language of communicators in state establishments in their locality. So wherever they live in the city or village, we ask them, how do we think, what should be the language of oral communication in state establishment of their locality? So I do not have comparable data for 2012, but for 2017 and 2022, we see a drastic change. Yeah, so the choice is here not between Ukrainian and Russian, but between Ukrainian and the customer or employee choice. So the alternatives were like that: in Ukrainian, in Russian, as preferred by employee, as preferred by customer. Logically, more people want the choice to be by customers than by employee. But unfortunately, a lot of people still believed, at least in 2017, that the employee of the establishment has the right to choose and impose the choice on the customer, which is kind of illiberal, but that's how people thought. In 2017, 2/3 of Russian speakers wanted this freedom of choice rather than the obligation to use Ukrainian. In 2022, almost 2/3 want it to be Ukrainian only in state establishments rather than the choice. Again, we can see that we can say that it is illiberal. The priority of rights is not respected, but we can say that people want the state language to be really the language of communication rather than in state language in name only, on paper only. So that's how people want it. That's how, and mind you, this is how Russian speakers want it. For the entire sample, it would be like 90%. Yeah, for Russian speakers, 2/3 want it to be in Ukrainian. So when having service in Ukrainian at state establishments, they would not consider it discrimination. They would believe that the right thing to do. And finally, for non-state sphere, so it's comparison of public servants and service providers, but the question is a bit differently. It is a question: would you agree that public servants, or in the next question, service providers, are obliged to respond in Ukrainian to those people addressing them in that language? So how we honor the rights of Ukrainian speakers to be serviced in their language. And here we see that even in 2017, for public servants, it was almost a half, but sorry, something is wrong. It's all right. So for almost half of Russian-speaking respondents believe that public servants are obliged to speak Ukrainian to Ukrainian speakers visitors, but less than 30% extended this obligation to private sphere, to service industries. In 2022, 2/3 of all Russian-speaking respondents want this to be mandatory to public servants, and almost half want it to be mandatory to service providers. So they understand that this is not discrimination of these service providers. This is their obligations to service customers in his or her language. So this is not a discrimination of Russian speakers, but prevention of discrimination of Ukrainian speakers. So this is, to me, an additional proof that Russian speakers are not discriminated against. It doesn't mean that they cannot be discriminated in the future, or in some practices, maybe even now. That doesn't mean that in certain situations, their choice in favor of Russian cannot be neglected. And as a democratic state, Ukraine should take care of that. Definitely, we cannot expect Russian to be freely used in all domains as it used to be. In most nation states, and Ukraine is definitely now by identities of its citizen nation state, in most nation states, one language prevails in all domains. But in some domains, such as education, such as the media, minority languages are also used whenever it is feasible. So we are not there yet. Russian is still much more than a minority language, but it is changing in that direction. And so we will need to take care of the rights of Russian speakers as Russians and Russian speakers as a minority, but definitely the times when Russian was the dominant language of all domains and it was imposed on people, for example, in the workplace, are certainly gone. So I think that's the main misconceptions my data allow me to disprove. And if you have question about other arguments, other beliefs, I will be happy to answer that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Kulik. This was really, really fascinating overview of your recent research and the context going back already a few years in Ukraine. We have lots of questions already in the Q&A, but if you still have a question you'd like to ask Professor Kulik, please do put it into the Q&A and not into the chat. But I would like to kick off the discussion with my own question, if that's okay. And that's about, you described in a lot of detail, very interesting detail, the dynamics of change recently, so from 2012 through 2017, then the most recent research. And I'm wondering about the reasons for the changes. And obviously the war has clearly had a huge impact on people's attitude towards language, alienating people from the Russian language, as you said. But I'm wondering, obviously, when people make the decision to switch languages, we can speak about push factors and pull factors, pushing them away from one language and pulling them towards another language. So I want to ask you, what are the pull factors that attract people to the Ukrainian language? What advantages do they see in the Ukrainian language? Because this can't just be about people being alienated from Russian because they associate it with Russian military aggression. And also, sort of related to that, we see obviously the war is a big factor, but also there have been language reforms in Ukraine in recent years, and especially in 2019. And to what extent would you see the war as the main factor, or the actual language policy and language reforms of recent years has been the main factor?
Thank you. I believe both are important. I would say like that, in an article I published in German earlier this year, I called Ukrainian currently as the language of resistance. And my argument is that people use Ukrainian also to resist Russian aggression and Russian imperialism they believe is underlying the aggression. Yeah? So they do not want to support Russian imperialism by their own linguistic practice. But to be able to do that, to act on that belief, they need kind of environment, they need infrastructure. And so the use of Ukrainian, increasing use of Ukrainian in both public and private sector, according in particular to the 2019 law, enables them to switch to Ukrainian and to act in resistance to Russian aggression. So Ukrainian can perform this function of language of resistance precisely because it has become the main language of various social domains in accordance with these post-Euromaidan language reforms. And as for pull factors, definitely the popularity of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture has greatly increased for the years of independence, and in particular for the post-Euromaidan years. Yeah, so a lot of YouTube channels, a lot of TV series, a lot of language classes, a lot of articles, and so on and so forth. So I don't have definite data which would demonstrate how popular Ukrainian culture is or something. If I look at data on choices people make, for example, for movies or for books, then I see increased interest in Ukrainian. Yeah. So, for example, a question for a number of years, not in this year. Imagine you want to buy a book by a foreign author and you have a choice between translation into Ukrainian and translation into Russian. Yeah, so originally many more people wanted a Russian translation because they believed consciously or subconsciously that Russian translation is better. That's the legacy of colonialism. Yeah, and then increasingly they switched to Ukrainian already in 2017. I saw that. So free language courses definitely a pull factor, but all this infrastructure of popularizing Ukrainian language as cool as high quality, as giving you chances for the better future, and so on. That was influential. But I still believe that the push, this alienation, is more important. Is this rapid, drastic change? You're muted.
Sorry. So I'll move on to some of our questions from the audience in a second, but we had a few questions which are basically on methodological points. So maybe I will just put those to you now briefly so we can clarify those before we move on to other questions. So someone asked about the language used by the interviewer in the research and whether that would have an impact on the answers given by the respondents. So whether they were starting off immediately in Ukrainian or Russian in the surveys that you referenced. The second point was about the sample size for the surveys. And the third, which is maybe a more complex question, was about the factor of Donbass and Crimea and the reliability of data from those places, and whether how that affects the comparison from 2012 to anything that happened after 2012, and how you factor that in. So if you
thank you.
respond to those first, and then we can move on.
As I explained, interviewer originally switched between Ukrainian and Russian, trying to elicit which language is preferred to the respondents. And then the interview was conducted in that language. At the end of the interview, actually, interviewers register in what language the interview actually took place. So maybe at the beginning, a respondent indicates that he or she prefers Ukrainian, and then in the process, he cannot sustain communication in Ukrainian and switches to Russian or mixes back and forth. So then that is registered too, but I didn't refer to this data. So questionnaires were available in both Ukrainian and Russian, identical. And if at the beginning, interviewers finds out that the respondent prefers Ukrainian, then the Ukrainian version is used, and the Russian version is used. Sample. It is about 2,000 respondents in each service, something like 2040, 2025, something like that. The standard is 2,000. That's and all minuscule changes of sample is due to the needs to provide the representativeness of genders and age groups and so on. And finally, comparability. That's an important question. I forgot to mention that, which I should have. Yes, the 2012 surveys covered all of the Ukrainian regions, and 2017 covered all but Crimea and the occupied parts of the Donbass. And 2022 also covered, in principle, all territories which were Ukrainian before 24 February 2022. But in fact, some parts of the newly occupied territories were underrepresented because of switching off mobile phones in those territories. So there was a procedure called WAIT to compensate for that, but I cannot be sure how perfect it is. So that's why I said that the error was big in 2022. But for the first two surveys, I made the data fully comparable by excluding in 2012 data those territories which were not available in 2017. So 2012 and 2017, I compared data from the same territorial scope. So territories is not a factor. So this is a real change in attitudes rather than changing in the scope of the survey.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying those things. So I think we'll move on to our first question from the audience, and that's from John van de Weert, who I believe we'll be able to see on camera. Yep, John, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. So thank you very much for your talk. So just sort of some context of my question. So I'm a So I study Russian musicology and Russian popular music. So my question is about the longevity of your data and your findings. Within my field, there's a push away from using Russian as a language and more so using English as more kind of a universal language. So I was curious about the longevity. Will the results that you see be the same 5 years from now, or is it a reactionary thing and Russian will go back to being the predominant language, or do you see the motivation to use Ukrainian as this the common language in private and business affairs? Do you see that as a trend that will live past, let's say, once the war has hopefully concluded, or do you see it as a temporary phenomenon?
Thank you. I definitely see it as a long-lasting phenomena. Definitely, the trauma caused by this aggression is too deep and too big to be overcome so quickly. So for most people, Russia is the enemy or as the aggressor for at least for a long time. Some say for good, but you never say never. At least for decades, this trauma will be felt. There can be some return to practicalities and the spread of Russian, the proficiency in Russian is a practicality which should be weighed and will be weighed against the ideal factors of hatred and alienation and all that. But if we compare 2014 data, I did not refer to it, but I had a survey conducted in September 2014 and then in 2017. I did not see any going back toward Russian if we compare 2014 and 2017. If anything, Ukrainian became much more widespread in 2017. So there is no need to believe that this time will be differently, especially because the trauma is deeper. So I expect the spread of Ukrainian will continue again, especially that there are preconditions for that there are state policies for that there are infrastructure for that. So I don't expect any going back to Russia.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We have now a question from Mel.
Hello. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Kulik, for such a fascinating presentation. I'm the Slavonic librarian at the University of Cambridge, main university library. So various languages are greatly of my interest. And I wondered if you had anything to say about surjik. I'm not sure if it was something you would have covered in your research closely, or might have anything that came out of these surveys. But I'd be really interested to hear anything any thoughts you might have. Thank you.
Surjik, of course, is a real thing in terms of language practice, but it is also a kind of a myth. It is a belief. If you ask people, sometimes you can hear that the majority of Ukrainian population speaks surjik. So surjik, the notion of surjik as a label combines two things. The mixture of two languages, what linguists call code mixing, but also the imperfect language. Any kind of imperfect language, if you don't speak Ukrainian, ideally, many people would say that you speak surjik. And basically, this is asymmetrical because less than ideal Russian is less likely to be labeled as surjik than less than ideal Ukrainian. That's again an imperialist legacy. But people themselves are not so readily classify their own language as surjik, then other people classify their language as surjik. So we should keep in mind that what many people believe is surjik is people's attempt at speaking a certain language, usually Ukrainian. So that's why in my surveys, I do not provide that option, surjik, because I believe it messes with the data. Precisely because the notion of surjik combines this mixture and imperfection, you cannot say which is which. So if some people would say the language is Surgic or other language is Surgic, you don't know what they mean. So I don't know, use that. But in some surveys, I saw the notion of Surgic used. Some 3% of respondents, or 4% of respondents would admit to speak in Surgic. But on the other hand, there is this registration of language spoken by respondents as done by interviewers. So like I mentioned, at the end of the interview, interviewer registers the actual language the respondents used in the interview. Of course, it's subjective, but it's an indication by a well-informed person. And something like 10 to 12% said that there was a mixture of languages. So people do mix languages, partly because they're not proficient highly in one language, partly because they feel emotionally attached to some language, partly because they might feel that certain topics is better, for some topics this language is better fitted, and for the other topic other language, so for a variety of reasons. But also Surgic is used intentionally by many people as a means of creativity. People express themselves in Surgic, so that's not for want of proficiency. That's for wish to be funny, for wish to be kind of complex, for wish to allude to something outside of their preferred language, and so on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we now have a question from which relates to the language situation in Kazakhstan, partly, and that's from Ayganim. Can you ask your question, please?
Oh, yes. So I'm from Kazakhstan, and as you might know, Kazakhstan is also a post-Soviet country. And same as in Ukraine, people in Kazakhstan who live close to Russia prefer to speak Russian up until now, but after the Russian invasion, people start to learn Kazakh, people started to attend free classes, and etc. So my question is that you earlier said that Ukrainian can be a language of resistance, but can we say that Russian language is not Putin? Because Russian language is more than just the Russian invasion, and it was a part of culture of many Soviet, ex-Soviet Union countries. And also, a lot of people say that why do you only blame Russian when people still speak and prefer to learn French, German, and English? But all these three languages are also languages of ex-empires. So this question is quite interesting for me because it's quite existential, because young generation in Kazakhstan is also facing the same problem of whether to speak Kazakh or Russian in their daily life. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Kazakhstan is one of the countries covered in my book that we have mentioned at the beginning. I wrote a book about language policies in multilingual countries, and Kazakhstan is one of the 17 cases considered there. Unfortunately, it's in Ukrainian. Unfortunately for you, it's in Ukrainian, so you'll probably not read it. But I know the situation in Kazakhstan pretty well. At least knew the situation by the time I wrote the book. So I heard a bit about this change in Kazakhstan, and I am happy that our struggle also induced and encouraged Kazakhs to struggle against the Russian imperialism and in this assertion of their national identity, including their linguistic identity. Yeah, but in response to your question about other imperialists and their languages, my question would be like this. First, it's older, and so it's partly forgotten. Russian imperialism and Russian aggression is fresh. It's happening now. If France waged a war in Algeria like it used to do 60 years ago, then definitely many Algerians would feel alienated from French, who now treat it pragmatically as a language of global communications, a language of access to high culture and to technology and so on. For Ukrainians, at least, I don't know about Kazakhs, but I think it's similar. If we have a choice between English as a global language, which is not our language, which is not our best known language, but which opens for us the door to the world. And if we choose between English and Russian as an intermediate language. So if we were to choose between direct access to the world and access through the mediation of Russian, we would definitely choose the former. First, one translation and is definitely better than two translations. And in addition to that, perhaps for most Ukrainians, the decisive argument now is that it is not the English, it is not the Americans who conquer us, who kill us. It's the Russians who kill us. So why should we perpetuate the role of Russian as the main language of the post-Soviet space? I hope Kazakhs are with us on that.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have lots and lots of questions, and I can already see that we probably won't get through all of them, but we'll do our best. So we have two questions which relate to a similar topic, and that's minorities in Ukraine other than Russian speakers or Russians. So I'll read one of the questions out, and then I'll pass over to one of the questioners who will ask his own question. So the first question is from Nikolai Ratio. He says, there are many stories, probably Russian propaganda, that other minorities' languages, not just Russian, are now being forbidden in schools in favor of only Ukrainian. Supposedly the Romanian foreign minister wrote to President Zelensky protesting this. Is there some or any truth in these stories? So that's the first question. And I think Roger will also ask a related question. Roger, please.
Okay.
Yes, well, thank you. And that says a lot of what I was going to ask indeed. I suppose there is a difference, say, between Hungarian as a minority language and Russian, as far as Russian was a lingua franca, for better or worse, in Ukrainian, whereas Hungarian has never been. So, so I'm interested in what difference or what similarities, yes, whether there's any similar research, and also the question of whether your Russian speakers, what their attitude would be to Hungarian as a language and its rights. Thank you.
Thank you. So I lately have not studied other languages than Ukrainian and Russian. So partly because my research is nationwide and based on surveys. So because the shares of speakers of other languages is so low, they cannot be properly studied by surveys with a sample of 2,000. So you would need 10,000, for example, which is prohibitively expensive to have enough of speakers of Hungarian and Romanian, at least these two languages, not to speak of Gagauz or Greek or whatever. So there is some regional research. If you conduct a survey within one oblast, then you will have a share sufficient to register changes. But I used to do research on Hungarian language education. It was 13 years ago, during the first attempt to change the language regime of Ukrainian schools for minorities, which provoked some discontent and some protests in kin states. So what I can say, first, Hungarian and Romanian are still used in education much more than minority languages in almost all European states, with the exception of Hungarian in Slovakia and Romania, and maybe a few more. So Hungarian and Romanian are still used in and the main language, and in secondary education, and as one of the two languages. Some subjects are taught in Hungarian and Romanian, and some subjects in Ukrainian. I believe it is the combined language regime, the bilingual education is the preferred solution, because the practice showed that if these minorities are exclusively taught in their respective minority languages, they do not know Ukrainian sufficiently, and they cannot compete on the job market. They do not have proper access to higher education. So in effect, they are discriminated against. So they are forced to remain in their villages, or they are forced to go to their kin states. And maybe Hungary would love for Ukraine to educate Hungarians by Ukrainian taxpayers' money, and then have them for Hungarian job market. But Ukraine doesn't see the reason to do that. Ukraine wants these people to stay in Ukraine. And to stay in Ukraine, they need to know the state language. So they need to know both the minority language to keep their identity and the majority language to have this social cohesion, social integration. So I believe this combined language regime provides that. There are some controversies. In terms of Hungarians, I see the main problem is the position of the Orban government in Budapest, which instigates the discontent of Hungarians. Hungarians themselves are much more pragmatic. My research, at least, it was 13 years ago, but even then, many understood the need to learn Ukrainian. But if their kin state, if the governments who pay the money encourages them to protest, to believe that this is discrimination, so many of the organizations espouse this position. But I don't think it's discrimination if they know both languages, if they can have jobs using both languages, if they can have education, higher education. So I believe there is no risk for them to lose their respective languages. That would be the problem. If they would not have enough opportunities to hear and learn and use their native language, yeah? But that is not the case. The kin state is close. They watch television. They travel to regularly to their kin state, so they have schools with portion of their languages. They have books. They have lots of infrastructure. So it's not ideal, but like I say, it's much better than in most European states.
Okay, thank you. So another question. A topic that's come up in a few of the questions is migration, and the fact that people are, of course, leaving Ukraine in huge numbers, and what effect this might have on language use. So I'll read out one of those questions, which is from Ada Wordsworth. What is the impact of the mass exodus from Ukraine on the use of Russian? Have you been able to study how Ukrainian refugees living throughout Europe have altered their language use, especially parents who may have brought their children up in Russian pre-war and relied on their schooling to teach them Ukrainian?
I haven't studied that. I'm eager to read studies of other scholars. I am, with my colleague Slada Belanyuk from University of Washington, we are co-editing a special issue of a journal called Social Linguistic Studies, which where a number of submissions. We just got abstracts for future articles. A number of these abstracts propose research on Ukrainian communities abroad. So it will be a fascinating studies. Many scholars are actually found themselves in these countries, so they have access to these communities. They will have fascinating data. So the research on Ukrainian communities abroad will be no less telling than research on Ukrainians in Ukraine. But from what is known in social media and in first kind of tentative research projects, is that many Russian speakers who found themselves either in other parts of Ukraine, for example, in Western Ukraine, predominantly Ukrainian speakers, Ukrainian-speaking Ukraine, or abroad, switch to Ukrainian language. They consider it inappropriate, especially abroad. They consider it inappropriate to be seen as Russian speakers because the nuances of Ukrainian language situation are less known abroad, and those speaking Russian would be considered Russian, and that's unbearable to most Ukrainians. Yeah, some still want to keep Russian, but then there is another challenge. If they want to stay there for a long time, they need their children especially to learn the local language. So that's a problem. If they want their children to learn Ukrainian now, because they didn't properly learn it earlier, and they want to learn German or Polish or Czech or whatever language, that's a lot. And we cannot be sure how successful the children will be if the children are at school and learning the local language. So they will invest. Supposedly, they will invest more in that language, and Ukrainian might be neglected. But the idea that they should learn Ukrainian and speak more Ukrainian is there. How much of that is sustainable is an empirical fact I cannot tell yet.
Okay, thank you. And just maybe related to, so Ada's question raised the question of parents and children. We did have another question from Lena, who asks, does age, generation, experience have anything to do with these changes, or the speed, ease of change? So that's an interesting question about young.
Thank you. I even thought of identifying another misconception related to age, but then I thought data are not very conclusive, not as illuminating and as regions or language groups, so I decided not to. But basically, many people argue, many Russian speakers, for example, argue, it's hard for us old people to switch to Ukrainian, but our children will definitely do. So there will be no problem for them to speak Ukrainian freely and eagerly, and that will solve the language problem. That's not the case. If parents speak Russian at home, children pick up Russian. And if enough people continue speaking Russian as their main language, Russian becomes a language of playground, and then Russian becomes a language of school, informal language of school. In lessons, they might use Ukrainian, but in breaks, during the breaks, they use Russian. So Russian is reproduced. And my survey data showed for a number of years that there was not much difference in language practices between younger generation and older generation. In some cases, I saw a bit of glimpse of hope that there is this change. Younger people, at least my data of 2012 in comparison with my data of 2006 showed this change, that younger people tend to become more Ukrainian speaking than older people. And by 2014, that effect disappeared. So basically, there was not much change between age cohorts in their language practices. But what I can say is that younger people tend to be more progressive, so to say, in their views, in their attitudes. So if they speak the same amount of Russian as their parents, they would be more supportive of the use of Ukrainian in society and in promotion by the state than their parents. That was the effect. So, but for the last survey, I have not checked that yet. Maybe now the parents become as pro-Ukrainian as the children. So maybe it's that effect no longer statistically significant. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. So I think we're just over our allotted time, but I think I will ask a couple of final questions before we wrap up. And those are perhaps appropriately questions looking into the future. So we did have one question from Jen, who asks, do you think the shift to Ukrainian will continue until Russian is no longer spoken, say 20 years down the line, or will Donbass and Crimea always remain bilingual? So obviously, predicting the future is always a difficult and perhaps foolish thing to do, but we'd be interested to hear your thoughts. And just finally, in relation to that, my colleague Alex Kruglov has asked the question about the future and the liberation of Ukraine. What do you think about language planning in post-war Ukraine? So any sort of thoughts about where policy takes us after the war?
I believe Russian will not disappear, and Russian will not even in the foreseeable future become kind of proper minority language. There will be, at least as long as I am alive, there will be not so little Russian as there is Hungarian or Polish. Yeah? So Russian will always be the second language. And it's good that not the first language, it will be the second language of Ukraine, competing increasingly with English rather than with Hungarian or Polish or Romanian or Greek. Many Ukrainians will learn English and believe that English is more important. Even now, more people believe that English is more important. If you ask a question about language regime of schools, everybody says that English should be taught at school. A few people say Russian should be taught at school. Most people believe Russian should not be taught, but it will be picked up anyway from television, from the street, from elsewhere. So Russian will remain as a language over a considerable part of the population as the first language or a second language. Maybe they will. I predict that for a foreseeable for some period of time, there might be a dichotomy, kind of even a diglossia, that Russian will be still used in private life by many people, but they will know that in public life, Ukrainian is the proper language. So Ukrainian will be that high language of according to classification by Ferguson, and Russian will be low language. It's not a derogatory term; it's just a functional term. Yeah. So many people even now speak Russian on the cell phone or with their friends, and then they enter an establishment and switch to Ukrainian. And this is the process which is long overdue, because it's what's happening in most other societies, but in Ukraine, it's post-colonial societies, it's not happening. French or English, and in our region, Russian is still high enough, predominant enough to be considered appropriate in establishment, in businesses, and so on. So Russian will persist. As for language planning, I just forgot to mention, Russian will persist, but it will not be as widespread and not as predominant as to be considered dangerous. There might be a bit of a kind of a paranoia in some sectors of society who are so alienated from Russian, who are so hateful toward all things Russians, that they would be antagonized even by the small amount of Russian. But I think that's something a liberal state should take care of, and a liberal society should overcome. As for language planning, definitely the main challenge will be similar to other Eastern European and post-Soviet states, how to, not post-Soviet, Eastern European and European states, how to balance the promotion and the preservation of the national language and the spread of the global language, English. So more and more people will use English in more and more domains, and then there would be a danger that in some domains, English will become predominant, will prevail over Ukrainian, and that will be considered dangerous by many people. And then there should be some kind of a balance. The pendulum will swing back and forth. So if I look at Estonia, I'm happy for them that they learned English so spectacularly, but I'm a bit wary of the predominance of English in higher education, at least in math and sciences. Yeah, so this is happening right in front of our eyes. We in Ukraine are still far from that. But if we talk 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, that's the main challenge. But like I say, let's live to see that. So first, we need to win the war. We need to overcome the predominance of Russian as inherited from the Russian Soviet Empire. We need to establish Ukrainian as a truly national language prevalent in all social domains. And then, of course, we will need to learn language and use language to communicate with the world. And so that there will be a challenge of balancing language with Ukraine, but that's a challenge for the future.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Kulik, for such a rich presentation, but also for answering all these very diverse questions in such detail. And apologies to all of those who asked questions and we couldn't get to them. There were just too many, I'm afraid. And also many very complimentary comments as well about how interesting and important the talk was. So it just remains for me really to thank everybody who attended the talk, to thank the organizers, the ProLang group at UCL CIS and also Ukrainian Institute London, to thank Professor Kulik most of all, but also
Thank you, my pleasure.
One final word of thanks, which we were discussing just before we started the webinar, is to the municipal workers in Ukraine who are keeping the electricity running. And thanks to them, we were able to have this discussion.
And to the armed forces, which protect me in Kyiv, I was able to stay in Kyiv through this almost 11 months of war. At some points in the spring, the Russian forces were just 10 kilometers from my home, but I still had the internet and electricity and some food in the store. So it was a miracle, and I'm deeply grateful to all people who made that happen.
Absolutely, and we are deeply grateful to them for making it happen so that we could listen to you. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and keep in touch for all future events at UCLCs. You can check on our website, you can check on the ProLang website, and you can also check for future Ukrainian Institute London events as well on their website and social media channels. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.